All right, I'm Mark Bauerlein. I'm a professor of English at Emory University, and I'm here speaking with Todd Gitlin. I'm playing the role of, somewhat the role of interviewer here in this process. Todd is a professor of journalism and sociology at Columbia University, and he is in fact one of the leading intellectuals in America today. He's been playing that role for a few decades now. He was an important figure in the student movements of the 1960s, where he served in other capacities, among other capacities, as the president of the Students for a Democratic Society. And since then, he's gone into academia and compiled a prolific record as a writer on sociology, media studies, and political commentary. Among his major books are an important history memoir of the 60s entitled The 60s, Years of Hope, Days of Rage, and another one that I've been particularly interested in is Media Unlimited, How the Torrent of Images and Sounds Overwhelms Our Lives. He's also a contributor to the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, and everywhere else, including being on the editorial board of Dissent magazine, which was founded by one of the figures profiled in his most recent book, Intellectuals and the Flag, Irving Howe. So today's starting point is that book, Intellectuals and the Flag, which provides several angles on the place of intellectuals in U.S. society, especially in a post-9/11 age. It profiles three exemplary intellectuals, David Reesman, Irving Howe, and C. Wright Mills, as well as sections on media values, citizenship values, and higher education values. Responses to the book have largely skipped those sections, however, and focused on something else, Todd's treatment of the left and the right in its intellectual forms. And while we can talk about some of those responses, for the moment, I'd like to hold off on those and instead quote a couple of representative sentences in the book. These are successive sentences that appear in the first chapter, and they read, "The Marxism and postmodernism of the left are exhausted. Conservative thought has collapsed into market grandiosity and nationalist bombast." Now, you hit both sides here, Todd, and you do the same thing in your talks. In fact, the first time I encountered you, saw you, was at a meeting in 2002 when I went up to Washington to attend a conference of the National Association of Scholars, a group of some professors, scattered professors, a few intellectuals, and some public figures who are on the right and dedicated to combating what they perceive as the ideological tidal wave and the identity politics on college campuses today. And this was certainly an antagonistic crowd to Todd Gitlin. And when I looked around and saw the audience and measured the ideological proportions, it was about 300 to 1. And the one was you, Todd. On the other hand, one of the responses to your book mentions your attendance, your talk at the 2003 Socialist Scholars Conference, a group of people well on the left, and there you received a similarly antagonistic response, at least at one point. And I wanted sort of to begin by asking you how this comes about. You walk in, I mean, apart from just saluting your courage and their fortitude, in walking into a room that is likely going to be an unpleasant experience. It's not all that nice to be so outnumbered, and yet trying to walk in and deliberate over the issues and stick to your principles while talking to people who are right off the bat not going to agree with them. And so if you see this as a significant situation for you or for intellectuals in America today, what would you say?
Okay, I'm going to put the phone down now. Mark, first of all, thanks a lot for collaborating with me in this, for me, unprecedented endeavor. I mean, I'm coming late to cyber dialogue in this fashion, and it's all kind of in this disembodied way so far extremely fascinating, and you've given me a very nifty rollout into the runway. I suppose a simple answer to the question, and not a very illuminating one, is that I'm just cantankerous. A more high-minded and principled answer, which I think is also true, is that I'm really very hopelessly old-fashioned and square, as we used to say, about the life of the mind. I think it's an enormous privilege to live a life in which somebody's paying you to talk to students and read books and write matters on matters that are dear to your heart. And the tenure system has as one of its marvelous features that when you get to a certain point, you get to do this, and you have to commit a rather sizable act of moral turpitude to lose the privilege. So, since this is, for me at least, the best life I could imagine, why shouldn't I, and parenthetically everyone else who has this status, avail ourselves of it? I actually am rather unimpressed by my colleagues over the years who fail to avail themselves of the opportunity and who take comfort in the herd. The herd is never an awfully intelligent animal enterprise, regardless of what key it's moving in. And so I feel an obligation to be not cantankerous for the sake of it, but to be straightforward and as thoughtful as I know how to be, which sometimes means, as somebody, I think maybe Nietzsche once put it, thinking against yourself. That is, making the effort to appreciate the state of mind and to engage with people whose state of mind is contrary to or apart from or other than yours. And specifically politically, I suppose I have different reasons, or maybe somewhat different spirits in which I engage both left and right-wing antagonists or naysayers. For the left, I'm actually an old-fashioned liberal. The 60s were such, and the vagaries of history in the 60s when I came of age and got involved in politics were such that I was dragged to the left. One of the chapters of the book you mentioned, the 60s, is called Leftward Kicking and Screaming. And that's really what an autobiographical note. I was a liberal. I held to liberal values. The exigencies were such that liberal orthodoxy didn't rise to the occasion, and so I started to consider myself a radical at some pretty early point, maybe as early as 1961 or 2. The thrust of the movements of the state, movements are very exciting and they're necessary and they're also dangerous and they're intellectually dangerous. And what happened to me, I think happened to a number of people. It certainly did happen to me that I muted my clarity at times because I was rolling with the zeitgeist. There were reasons to do that, but there was a price. And one of the prices was that I suppressed some of my inner doubts, sometimes really quite vigorous doubts that I had come by honestly in the very early stages of my political development. I never had any illusions, for example, about communism. I read, the first political book I can remember reading in high school was a book by Max Eastman called Reflections on the Failure of Socialism. I had read Orwell. I read Arthur Koestler's dark excavations into the communist mind. I took courses on the Soviet Union and China, and so on and so on. So I should have been more fortified than I was, and I wasn't, or rather I submitted my fortification to
it was a strong zeitgeist
impulses, and I regret that. I regretted it, and I regret it. And I resolved at some point, I suppose in the 1970s, that I wouldn't let it happen again. And I haven't. So that's a long-winded part of the answer about what I'm up to vis-a-vis what I've come to think of as the fundamentalist left, the blame America first left. So far as my relations to intellectuals of the right, it's something different here. I'm seriously disappointed in intellectuals of the right. This is actually a personal note, but it bears on this. This book, Intellectuals and the Flag, which is deeply critical of a certain tendency on the left, like earlier books of mine, which have been deeply critical of the fundamentalist left, have been greeted by right-wing periodicals largely with loathing and abuse. And I was actually rather thrilled when just this summer, a year and a half after the Intellectuals and the Flag came out, I was sent a review which was both critical and respectful, and I was not just respectful but understanding. A review by a professor in Tennessee named Wilfred McClay, who I don't know. It was the first time I can remember, quite seriously, and I'm saying this not out of self-pity, but with a hard, flinty, analytical look. It's the first time I can remember getting a grown-up review from a conservative intellectual in 20 years. There were some, I consider, sober and serious-minded reviews of my 60s book, but that was 20 years ago. And I take this to be a great default. Again, not because it's a personal insult. I don't really care about that. But I take this to be a serious intellectual default. There are intellectuals on the right who I take extremely seriously. James Q. Wilson is one who comes to mind. I took a course from him in college. I learned a lot from him. He writes for journals that I don't much admire, but he doesn't occupy a lot of space in the public domain. The space of right-wing talk in media, and we might want to get into how different that is from a world of serious intellect, that space is taken up by gangsters like Ann Coulter and Limbaugh and Bill O'Reilly and that gang, David Horowitz, people who are not intellectually serious, and I seriously want the engagement. So when I criticize the intellectuals of the right, it's because I actually think any serious person knows that the intellectual tradition we're in is one that is in some ways liberal and in some ways conservative. In some ways, I would say I'm deeply committed to conserving liberalism, which makes me de facto a conservative in certain respects. And instead of having a serious discussion in public about these matters, we get the diatribes and the ad hominem crap from the likes of the Wall Street Journal editorial page and so on. So I have high expectations about intellectual duty. That's I suppose the summary sentence.
Let me come back to the issue of right-wing conservatives, intellectuals in a minute. But first, let me ask, just right off the bat, Todd, because I too see in academia an extraordinary missed opportunity all the time. We have people with tenure who are precisely empowered to go out there and square off with unpopular opinions. And yet, when I go to academic conferences and they address controversial subjects, the dais is stacked with people who all think the same thing. Or I should say, they all believe the same thing about the big questions, and they quibble endlessly over the little questions within their own turf. And to me, I've never been able to understand this formula, which is that one of the most pampered and protected labor groups in our nation, the tenured professorate is so shot through with cowardice and conformity and prestige consciousness. I don't know why. I can't figure it out, because nothing will happen to people who stand up and argue the other side, except their colleagues down the hall won't quite like them as much as they did before. That seems to be a pretty small loss, when you consider the benefits of your own intellectual independence. Do you know why this is? Do you agree with that characterization?
I agree with it a great deal, and it's I think less interesting for me to say where I disagree with it than to start by affirming that this is all too true. And I've read some of what you've written in an attempt to understand this great disappointment. In one way, the professoriate is like a decadent aristocracy. It is chock full of privilege, but it's also, the vulgar word is lazy. The fancier expression would be that it has an ideology of critical freedom, with which it disguises from itself that it's actually made peace with the world. And I don't mean political peace. I mean, as Irving Howe said, and I think I may quote it in that essay, Marxism went to the universities to die in comfort. Human beings
in
are
your
intellectuals,
book,
are human beings.
You have a formulation, the Great Refusal of the 1960s, which was the...
Sorry, Mark?
Yes.
Say that again?
Your formula in the book of the Great Refusal announced by Marcuse, which was, again, this radical negation of bourgeois norms, mainstream middle-class American society, all the way down to its deepest values, which is, again, ennobled among the left now as resistance, but really it comes down to negation. That Great Refusal found somewhere to go in order to thrive long past its sort of public zeitgeist power, and that was into the university, where as you call it, a retreat from politics. And the thing is that this Great Refusal of bourgeois society is lived in a contradictory way by the academics who can go to the conference or talk in class and articulate a cultural theory or a theoretical analysis that shakes mainstream norms to their very foundation. And then they go back to their homes, they go back to their families, they pick their kids up from private school, or they enjoy the comforts of tenure. And they're living a divided life at this point. And perhaps this explains one of the motives for conformity and for not going to that conference where you're going to walk into a room and nobody likes what you have to say. You're going to enjoy the blandishments of belonging to others. But I think the posture of adversarial condition in relation to American society, it simply doesn't wash. And this may be one reason why, as you say in the beginning of the book, that left-wing intellectuals may have ideas that are, for the most part, popular in the general public, but the general public mistrusts the left-wing intellectuals themselves.
Right. One interesting angle in this story, I suppose I would think of it ecologically. There's been a process of mutual adaptation. I still think that Richard Hofstadter's book of 1964, Anti-Intellectualism in American Life, holds up. He traces anti-intellectualism in American life to basically three roots. The role of evangelical religion in American life, the political uses of anti-intellectualism, and the anti-intellectualism of the business culture, the valuing of the practical as against the egghead. Mm-hmm. And there have been modifications in the last 30 plus years, but the self-enclosure of the professoriate of which we've been speaking exists in a sort of comfortable dialectic with the anti-intellectualism of the larger society. So you get a dynamic something like this. You've got academics who want to be, who at least want to affect rigor and deep criticism, even to the point of the sardonic, mocking stance, which the philosopher Richard Rorty wrote about in his parallel argument to mine before I did. You get an adaptation in which the mocking professoriate has pretty much given up on the country, thinks that the country is hopelessly benighted, and is inclined to feel like the odd man out, the kid who none of the teams will choose when it comes to choosing up baseball teams. And so the intellectuals are embittered, and they form a clerisy. They form a closed group with their own language and their own secret handshakes, which in turn reinforces the propensity of the cultural institutions, the press in particular, and politics, to denigrate intellectuals, and in particular academic intellectuals, as obscurantists, people who can't write their way out of a paper bag, and so on. And you get a sort of continuing dynamic. And you also get a dynamic of self-selection. That is, the people who set out to make the academic career, here I'm not talking about the hard sciences, but I am talking considerably of the humanities and social sciences, are people who self-select for that sort of life, a place which is hospitable. It is harder, actually, empirically, to live a life as an independent intellectual of the sort that is much more commonly found in Britain, on the continent, even in some places in Latin America. I don't know about Asia. I know quite a number of people, English intellectuals, for example, English, Scottish, Irish too, for that matter, who oscillate between academic positions, production work, making documentaries for the BBC or independent television or the French or German equivalents, writing for popular newspapers and magazines. This is all extremely common in Europe, but you can't make a career at it. I mean, speaking personally, I was out of the university for 9 years in the late 60s and early 70s. I never intended to make an academic career, but as Hunter Thompson said around the time when I decided to go back to the university, when the going gets tough, the weird turn pro. Universities actually are more hospitable, and most people, I like to think that I didn't forget how to write English because I didn't actually enter into a PhD program until I was 31, and I'd already published a couple of books and done a lot of writing of various sorts. People who aim right into academia, I think in some way welcome that it offers a sort of hiding place. I mean, its very language offers a hideout, and this is not good either for the academy or for the larger public.
No, I agree, and I unfortunately find that with their working conditions so set and secure, and with the incentives for continuing along the same path that they've been on. And the acculturation that takes place from the time you enter graduate school until the time you reach tenure, especially if it takes place right out of undergraduate years. You had many years to form and develop before going right through school. But people who enter graduate school at age 23, and these are some of the most successful ones in the humanities. They're hotshots, and they're going to Ivy League and the flagship universities, state universities. They adapt very quickly to the protocols of the profession, to the norms, and those norms involve not just disciplinary ideals and standards in the state of scholarship, but also norms of etiquette and conduct, what counts as professional conduct. And they adapt very smoothly and carefully. And this is many years that it goes on, 8 years of graduate school, and then you go on the job market, and then you join a department, which is like a big family with all of the benefits and all the dysfunctions of families as well. You come up for tenure, and by this time you're in your late 30s. And you've been in academia for a long time. You've been judged all along the way. You've had committees looking at your work, and it's a very small group that judges your work, that signs your dissertation, that accepts your book for publication, that writes letters about you for your tenure. And the narrowness just constricts every year along the way, and it's really hard to break out when by joining the academic club, by attending the conference at which one doesn't have to face real antagonists, then why change? You're tired. You're 40 years old. You have kids. Why walk into a crowd of 200 people who are going to ask questions telling you you're wrong, one after the other? That's not very nice. You go home and you don't sleep that well. What they don't realize is that the temporary discomforts of that actually do all the things that John Stuart Mill predicted would happen when you do face real adversaries. First of all, you acquire a thicker skin. Second of all, you better come up with some better evidence and better arguments and better rhetoric, or you're going to be beat next time. You sharpen yourself. It's a check on who you are. You avoid, as you said, the comforts of the herd, and those comforts are not to be underestimated. We all like to be around a reflective environment, but the thinking against yourself, as you put it a little while ago, that is again a form of tension. It requires an energy that too much of academia conspires against, especially if you have no taste, if you do want to retreat from the world and you have no taste for genuine intellectual contest and exchange. And so I think we can largely agree upon that. And your idea of the dialectic, I think that's actually a very sophisticated observation, that the academics are actually working with the anti-intellectualism of public life in America. What would they do if American public life, if we had more television shows with philosophers and intellectuals on them speaking in sort of a less academic way, in a more public way? What would they do? To me, it seems like they would almost be disappointed that they no longer had American intellectualism.
And as I'm sure you know, the academic who spends time, let's say, making documentary films or writing semi-popular books is often suspect by members of even a profession that doesn't affect to be scientific in a serious way. The humanities certainly have no legitimate claim and ought not to profess it to being scientific. But write too many op-ed pieces or appear on public radio or do something like that, and you're seen as a popularizer, and a popularizer is not a compliment. And I've been in meetings where faculty are making decisions about hiring, and
right.
as I'm sure you have, and this is no exaggeration.
The op-ed read by 150,000 people counts less than a scholarly article in a quarterly read by 20 people.
Well, it may not just count less; it may count negatively.
That's right. That's right. Well, Todd, let's I think we have about 10 minutes to go. Let's come back to the right-wing intellectuals situation, and your perception of them as foundering too much in anti-intellectualism and allowing people like Ann Coulter to become a representative of them. First of all, let me ask, do you see in the dialectic, the adversarial dialectic between the intellectual professors and the anti-intellectual public, are conservative intellectuals in some relationship there? Do they fall into that dialectic in some odd fashion?
It's a really interesting question. As a sociologist, I suppose my presumption is that yes, they must somehow. I think it's something like this. I think that the conservative intellectuals, to a large degree, I may be exaggerating here, but to some considerable degree, have struck their own devil's bargain. Their adaptation to the cultural ecology over the last 30 years or so has been to strike a bargain with power. And here I mean the combination of political power directly, Washington power, and the niches they find in the world of so-called think tanks, which are largely not think tanks. I mean, they're not Platonic academies. They are largely lobbying and publicity organizations. And what I mean is that that's their own sort of cushy niche. So they can engage in, there are wholly owned cultural organs to which they may have access as public intellectuals. I'm thinking specifically of the editorial pages of the Wall Street Journal, for which there's no equivalent on the left. They can ensconce themselves at the Hoover Institution in Stanford, or any one of a number of think tanks, Cato, Heritage, and so on, CSIS, and so on in Washington. That's another sort of intellectual corruption, another sort of adaptation. I think that power does corrupt, and that the dominance of the right in political power over the last 30 years has been deeply corrupting to conservative intellectual life. It has led to, a man with a PhD, William Crystal, edits a Murdoch-owned magazine and writes the most degraded sorts of polemics, and evidently feels no shame about it, and it's considered bad manners, I think. Let me put it this way. This is going to sound like a pat on the back, but it does come to mind. I've written critically about Michael Moore. I'm not the only person on the left. There's a whole book of criticism of Michael Moore by a left-wing journalist, Jesse Garner, a very good book. Where is the conservative book expelling Ann Coulter or Michael Savage or Rush Limbaugh from the ranks of serious people? Why are political intellectuals, the sort, let's say, who write for commentary or the national interest, why don't they take it as a project to oppose and to argue against the degradation of public discourse? They have also been getting along. They actually, I think, and I've had this said to me by conservative intellectuals. Why? That they actually think it's sort of adorable that there are these jerks who they think are crazy, but they're crazies. and they find them to be, to use an old Leninist term, useful idiots. Corruption of this sort is another sort of corruption.
I think that
actually, if I can just add a footnote.
Yeah,
here.
yeah.
It's interesting how in the last 2 years, I mean, basically, it's since the '06 election, I think we see something of a difference. We consider how much time it takes to put a book into production. We can be a little generous and say that starting around 04, 05, there have been conservative intellectuals who suddenly, from whose eyes scales have fallen, and who have discovered that George Bush and Dick Cheney and others around them are profoundly primitive and deceptive in their thinking. But I find it to be a grave sin, a collective sin, that it took them until the last couple of years to discover that the emperor had not so many clothes. I consider, for example, David Brooks to be a disgrace in this regard. He's a serious person, well-educated person. And these days he writes as if, well, all of us smarty pants were aware all along that the Bush people really didn't quite have their rock in their pockets the way they said. Well, if you go back, and I've done it, go back and look at what he and George Will and others, Crystal and Bill Bennett, other reputed conservative smart folks were saying in the run-up to the war. No, they didn't get it, and I think it's one of the imperatives of intellectual life to dig to the roots of error, including your own. I mean, it's right. The left needed the likes of George Orwell and Arthur Koestler and Max Eastman in his way, and James Burnham and others who'd been through the left and came to understand how damaged, how deep were its intellectual incapacities. But David Frum couldn't bring himself quite to do that. All the people I've mentioned, the people who were present at the conference where in Washington they referred to the National Association of Scholars, doesn't it strike these people? I'll even throw in my old professor James Q. Wilson, that there must be something profoundly corrupt in the intellectual enterprise that led conservative intellectuals to welcome George Bush, only now to be surprised that he's dragged the country into this cascade of catastrophes. It strikes me as a matter of intellectual duty to get to the bottom of that, and I'm waiting.
Well, let me mention a few people. Bruce Bartlett's book about.
I read articles of Bartlett's, and I think Bartlett is somebody who's taken this seriously. I haven't read enough of the book to know to what degree he thinks the budgetary default, which I take it as his primary concern. I don't know to what extent he thinks that there's something deep in anti-statist economics that underpins the flagrant dishonesties and malfeasances of Bush economics. I don't know one way or the other. Have you read him for that?
Yeah, a little bit on that. That's just a very harshly critical book of the Bush administration. And I'll say I know how you feel about William Crystal, but he was writing articles a few years ago trashing the Bush administration, asking them to dump Rumsfeld. And you've got, these weekly pieces in the Weekly Standard saying, you've got to put more troops on the ground. And I think this was sort of after the invasion, becoming very critical of where they stood on the practicalities, the logistics. And I think Francis Fukuyama...
Fukuyama I exempt from much of what I'm saying. I took Francis Fukuyama seriously. I actually think The End of History... I actually wrote a mixed review of the End of History book. I think it's a very smart book. I have some substantial disagreements with it, but it's a serious book. This is not a piece of hackmanship. And of course, he's now checked out. He now insists he's not a neoconservative. But I take your point about Crystal separating itself. But I don't know that he's done the intellectual work of understanding how it was that I know he preferred McCain, but in 2000. But the truth is that George Bush associated himself with a group of intellectuals who had a picture of the world which, if we're at all scientific about politics, has now been tested and found to be catastrophic. So even if you didn't think so before, I think you would want to go back and ask, it's not just a matter of criticizing Bush or Rumsfeld, but of understanding them. Where does this come from? And how could they be so blind? And that's the intellectual work, I think, that has not been done.
I think we need some deep, thorough assessments of the neoconservative foreign policy of those first 5 years, and some real political, geopolitical, and philosophical analysis of this venture, because it certainly has not panned out, and the neoconservatives are in serious retreat on this, and it's going to be a long time before any. I think you may disagree. I think it's going to be a long time before anything like this step with Iraq 5 years ago ever happens again. But let me go to the general point about the conservatives and their relationship to power. Mm-hmm. I think that conservative intellectuals are in a tricky position in this country because precisely they do not have nearly the footing in cultural institutions that liberal intellectuals or left-of-center intellectuals do. If you are a staunchly conservative intellectual, you don't have very many places you can go simply to maintain your livelihood. Washington, D.C. is where they all eventually end up. They do work in the think tanks for several of the magazines, a few of the think tanks in New York, like the Manhattan Institute. But it's a pretty small world, and it is by definition already related to power. Yes, the think tanks are there to craft policy and advocate with decision makers. And when you get in there, in that kind of world, you are tied to those powers. If you're in a university, in a tenured position, you have a lot greater freedom, and you can take more independent positions. But I can tell you many conservative intellectuals are very, very unhappy with the Republican Party right now, obviously with the Bush administration. But maybe this is the devil's bargain, but it's hard for them to have a platform. Where do they say this? Where can they where can they come out? Because most of them aren't editors. They don't have control over their own salaries. They don't have uncontingent support the way one does in universities or the other different cultural institutions that provide them security. And so it's sort of where their circumstances lead them. And it takes a heck of a lot to, they actually do see livelihoods at stake. I can tell you, I can't name names, but I can tell you of people who were removed from think tanks because of some of their writings, and that was their only means of support, and they had to scramble for a while. And they can't make it on their own from book contracts. Or from their journalistic work, and it's just a problem. I think you will find that things are turning, and you will get a lot more conservative intellectuals. Most conservative intellectuals, they can't They can't even read what Ann Coulter writes or what she says. They pay no attention to it. They know that this is hack publicity work. So, you know, they on the other hand, they're not going to come out and make her a target.
But why not?
Well, I think it may have to do with this position that they're in their connection to power. But I think I would add that they see a greater problem. They feel themselves vastly outnumbered by intellectuals on the left who are fomenting bad policies. And Coulter is out there just being tasteless. I think this is, perhaps they don't recognize the damage she does to conservative intellectual identity. Now,
but to look at the, you know, to me this is not a pretty picture you're painting, and I don't doubt your assessment of their state of mind. But again, I do take seriously that you know, intellectuals, first of all, are responsible for living dangerously, number one. It is a matter of character to be willing to bite at least the hand that shakes hands with the hand that feeds you from time to time, if reality shakes out that way. It is an obligation of the craft. And it is the obligation of intellectuals to criticize a corrupt culture. And you know, the culture is corrupt in many, many ways. One of the ways it's corrupt is that people who are professional liars, like Rush Limbaugh, have a following and are treated as serious people, as by other serious people. And this is it's not only bad for conservatives, it's a contribution to the general swamp of Babylon that we live in. The other thing is, you know, and this is, I think, something that's come up in some of the debates about your own piece on this subject in the Chronicle of Higher Education, wasn't it, a couple of years ago?
The liberal group.
The interesting question of why there are so few conservatives in the academy, or at least in the social sciences and the humanities.
Right.
And I think it's an important question, and I don't know that there's any good research on it. To me, it's self-evident that if you are the sort of conservative who values primarily, who regards free enterprise as the core of value, if you're a serious supporter of the Friedrich Hayek view of the world, that you are you're going to be drawn to a profession that harbors, or rather is sympathetic to the idea. Thus, you'll be drawn to Chicago school economics. But probably more than the practice of economics as an intellectual discipline, you're going to be drawn to the world of commerce. You're going to be drawn to banking and finance and CEO-manship, and likewise, you know, you're going to prefer to be a bond seller than somebody who scrambles from grant to grant, making documentaries for the Tribeca Film Festival, and now. I think there's, the profession of English, which you know a lot more about than I, is actually a very sad case, because there's absolutely no reason in the world why conservative intellectuals should either be or feel excluded from the cultivation of intelligent reflection upon literature because of their views on balanced budgets or censorship. I mean, that is an intellectual crime, and the degree to which it's self-selection and people don't want to be in a business, in a profession in which people speak in tongues, the degree to which it's the kind of cult, guild exclusivity, which you were speaking of before, the degree to which this is a problem of the supply side or the demand side, I don't know empirically. I'm sure both are at work in some measure. I have never been in a meeting. I mean, I can say legitimately, I've been in hiring and retention meetings now for 30. I've been teaching full time for 29 years at Berkeley, NYU, and Columbia. I have never heard anybody broach a matter of political ideology at a personnel meeting. Now, you could say, and I think there's reason to say, in equivalent situations, that some things are so deeply taken for granted that they never even rise to the level of articulation, and that might, in principle, be true. But on the face of it, the evidence for that proposition is very hard to gather. It was a fact that in the 60s, both the literary professions and sociology in particular, much more than either political science or economics, became a place for radicals. A sociologist friend of mine once said, the funny thing about sociology, he said, compare it. He was thinking of individuals he knew, and I'm sure only appreciated this because he was not a full-time professor. He was a visitor. He said, biologists love biological life. Chemists love chemical reality. Physicists love what particles do. Sociologists don't love society. He was right. There is a critical edge to it, and the way things broke out in the 60s, sociology in particular became a place for a kind of automatic leftism, which, there are still people who do good work within that range, but in principle there should be no reason why a conservative, somebody like, to name a name that's pretty much gone, Robert Nisbet or, I don't even know what the politics were of many of the sociologists I read. David Reisman, who was important to me, began as a liberal, never an orthodox leftist, and became more conservative. It didn't really matter. These were big thinkers about society. Daniel Bell, who's been all over the place politically, is a serious person. And people of that sort of critical edge, I think, don't think of sociology as a place where they're going to have a happy career, and this is to the detriment of both sides.
I would say that most personnel decisions, curricular decisions in humanities, they aren't mapped across conservative or Republican, Democrat, or conservative, liberal, conservative, progressive. A better term, I think, to oppose to conservative. But here's how it works. And it does fall out in analogous categories. The other day, we had a big discussion in a series of professors, and one professor was talking about the work we do, and I mentioned how much, not resentment, but ridicule and mockery one gets of humanities professors in public life. A professor gave a talk once at the NEH back in the 90s, in which she announced, this is a very well-known theorist, who announced, quote, English departments are leading a social revolution in this country. Just a fatuous statement, absurd. And it's that kind of self-puffery, I think, that exposes them to easy ridicule. But another professor came back with, look, if we understand education as challenging people's perceptions, as getting them to think critically about their own ideas, their own conventions, then I would say the more resistance we raise in public life, the better job we are doing. Now, one thing I wanted to tell him was, it's best for you not to say that in a public forum, because basically you're telling the more you people don't like us, the more certain we are we're doing the right thing. Yeah. The condescension is too thick. But I did say I agree with you 50%. Yes, that is what a humanistic education is supposed to do. But the other 50% is we are supposed to pass along literary traditions. We are supposed to make sure that our students simply read, be acquainted with Virgil and Shakespeare and Rousseau and Milton. And it is this traditionalist side of education that has been swamped with all this talk about creating new knowledges and bringing forward new theories and new ideas. And I think this is one place where we can say a conservative, traditionalist conservative, not social conservative or libertarian conservative, but traditionalist conservative in matters of culture, those people are squeezed out. These are simply considered old-fashioned themes. The other place is this absorption in identity themes. I mean, the fixation for some people on race, gender, sexuality. They talk about class, but actually few of them really do analyze class in the humanities. But it really is an obsession for some of them. I've been in meetings where a committee member has said, we can't hire someone who doesn't do race, quote unquote. And, there are other matters in human being. This is not to say that we should not have scholarship on race, but the exclusivity of that simply is overwhelming these days. And all you do is just look at a conference program and see how that works. But your point, just thought, I don't think I have a satisfactory answer as to why serious conservative intellectuals do not come out and analyze the popular discourse of conservatism, or what is taken as right-wing thought, the Rush Limbaughs and Ann Coulters. I mean, there are people who did trash Ann Coulter's work. For example, when she called George Orwell a conservative. Orwell was a socialist. Annie Applebaum wrote a great review of her that book in the Washington Post. The National Review dumped her after 9/11 with her. I can't remember the exact statement. We should all Christianize them or kill them.
Right, kill them. We should get in planes and go to the Middle East and kill all the leaders.
Yeah. I think the National Review dropped her there.
I think you're right.
But I think maybe this is simply a pragmatic decision for them to say there is a lot more important damage being done by the left. I mean, that whether one agrees with that or not, whether that's true or not, I think that's the position. But I'm not going to say that that's a satisfactory answer to you, and I'm going to ask some people about that. And I'm also going to send you a couple of essays written by obscure conservatives in some obscure journals that actually do some very trenchant analysis of neoconservative positions. One essay by a conservative who said, with friends like these, neoconservatives, we don't need any other enemies.
Well, I'd like to read them. I was so pleased by this review of my intellectuals book in the Claremont Review of Books that I subscribed, which is not a journal I'd ever seen before. And I read through the whole issue, and I thought these were serious people, so I subscribed to the periodical. I welcome these. I seriously welcome these dialogues.
Bill McClay, who wrote that, he's a serious guy. And
I gather, yeah.
He's a very temperate guy as well, even though he does take some strong positions. I thought his analysis in the review of your book, sort of really an amplification of his of the diagnosis of sort of the left-wing cultural politics and self-image. I thought was very good. I do agree. This is out of context here, but I think he did make too much of what you said about the Bush administration in the book. That was kind of such a sidelight.
Wait till he sees the new book, which has 100 pages on Bush, and might actually dislodge him from his phlegmatic.
Let's go ahead. Let's go ahead and announce the new book, which is out in a few weeks.
No, it's actually out.
It is
at
out.
This moment. Yeah, it's arrived. It's arrived. It's called the Bulldozer and the Big Tent.
Uh-huh.
Subtitled Blind Republicans, Lame and Democrats, and the Recovery of American Ideals.
As
Published
you know,
by John
Wiley. Todd?
Yeah.
Blind Republicans and lame Democrats. As one politician once said, there you go again.
Yeah.
You're antagonizing both sides.
Yeah. Before the book was published, I got an email from somebody attacking me because I was mocking disabled people.
Lame?
That was literally the first public comment I'm aware of about this book that hadn't even been published.
The identity sensitivities are cranked up to the maximum.
Yes. You don't think you don't think it's peaked, that sort of petty censoriousness?
I think it has peaked, but while it has peaked and is declining in public life, in certain sheltered niches, there is an inverse correlation. The more it declines in public life, the more rigid and censorious it becomes in those small little cells, and especially those cells that are protected by tenure.
For years, I've wanted to believe that we'd get to the end of it because, one wants to believe that the worm turns and the spiral of complexity resumes its operations. But I like you, am astonished frequently that people still talk this way. I remember I once had this conversation with Irving Howe. God, it was probably in the late 80s. And the question was, why hasn't the natural cycle of conflict in the academy played itself out? If the orthodoxy became, Derrida and Foucault in the 80s, then where's the cycle of rebellion? I mean, why doesn't anybody want to kill the father anymore? Why don't graduate students in English figure in a kind of venal way that there's a great reputation waiting for those who kill the fathers? And we agreed that this sort of natural tendency toward rebellion had somehow been aborted. I mean, I don't really have an explanation for it. Neither did he. But it's really peculiar, isn't it, that this is now an orthodoxy that's thrived for 30, 40 years. Whole generations of sons and daughters have marched through these institutions without turning them upside down, but simply striving to be the next incarnation of Stanley Fish. And I think this is, to use a conservative term, contrary to nature.
I would suggest a couple of things, but they're not fully explanatory. One is that when people embraced Derrida, Foucault, and some of the other totems, this was a full-scale ego construction. This was discipleship in extreme terms. And disciples have a hard time changing.
Why not rebellion against them by the next generation?
I think, one, if you showed your cards early, if you attacked Derrida, the Derridians would circle the wagons. I mean, these people were sectarian in extreme ways, and it was you're in or out. And they balanced their slavish devotion to the master with an intense hostility to outsiders, and they controlled a heck of a lot of departments. That's one thing. The other thing was, Derrida and Foucault and others of that generation provided such an intense theoretical model of killing the father that you're falling into line in a certain way intellectually. They won't let you kill the father institutionally, they all have tenure, and the time of tenure it's about 40 years that you own your chair, your office in a department. So institutionally they can have that control, but they can continue to play the intellectual games of killing one father after another on the Derridian model. So this I think is an expression of what you term in your book the displacement of real politics into cultural politics. And the reason and the thing about cultural politics being fake, the benefit of that is you can play cultural politics, and you can play the same cultural politics year after year after year. You can't play real politics. Real politics change. When you try to start a movement, things happen to the movement. It succeeds or it collapses. Circumstances become different, and so you have to adjust all the time. You can play the same cultural politics today that you played 25 years ago, and I see people do it all the time. So there's an institutional advantage to this displacement, even if it means, again, living this divided life between your intellectual vision and everything else that you do.
And nihilism is the gift that never stops giving. But still, I think the smart money is on the people who are plotting rebellion. They're thinking beyond. They're thinking to that time when the generation of conservative revolutionaries, that is to say, the postmodern generation, the capital T theory generation, will be shuffling off the coil, and
well, I think we can say that on
contrarian bet, I think, is one that spunky young intellectuals in a variety of fields ought to be undertaking. It's that the future belongs to the not yet anticipated rebellions.
I hope so. I think that what we see now is that the postmodernists, the theorists, and so on college campuses are simply allowed to exist in their marginal fashion. And if you're a dean, now you're simply investing your energies elsewhere. You're going into political science. You're going into, obviously, the hard sciences, the biological sciences, the new neuropsychology centers and public health and so on. You're simply letting the humanities and the softer social sciences, history, and so you're letting those founder. And
well, because it's a backwater anyway, and it doesn't bring any. It doesn't bring any. It doesn't bring in any money. So, yeah, in a sense, it's a minor enterprise in your holding company. So,
right.
Why devote a lot of energy to fixing it? I think there must be something to that.
Well, listen, Todd. Let's see what your latest book produces out there on the airwaves. Do you have no reviews out yet?
No. Publishers Weekly, but that's not a public organ. But yes, it'll be yet another template for. I seem to write these books in order to take the temperature of the culture, and it's my I stick my head out above the parapet to see who's shooting. Call it masochistic. Yes, it'll be interesting.
Well, we'll see if a few
to us anyway.
Maybe I'll try to prompt a few conservative periodicals to take notice.
I would love it. I wrote a book in the mid '90s called The Twilight of Common Dreams about the culture wars, and I was was quite scathing toward identity politics and postmodernism and so on. And I thought naively. With some trepidation, honestly, because my left-wing friends wouldn't like it if any conservatives actually thought there was any reason to engage with me. But I really stupidly thought that some conservatives would sort of understand what I was trying to do there. No. So, I was reviewed in the Wall Street Journal by a prominent conservative English professor of German, John Ellis. Absolutely trashed the book. the Washington Post, in its wisdom, assigned it to Peter Collier, a person with whom I publicly tangled.
Mm-hmm.
He trashed the book. In fact, I remember quite vividly, I was very pleased when one conservative journalist, a fellow named Philip Gold, who had a column for the Washington Times, wrote an appreciative book and actually did an interview with me. And it's not that he agreed with me all the way. It's that he and I both agreed that America, instead of arguing universalism versus particularism, that we should be arguing over different universalisms. The right-wing universalism was a laissez-faire one, and the left-wing universalism was an egalitarian one. I'm oversimplifying.
Mm-hmm.
And that would be a good argument to have. But he agreed that it was rather appalling that in general conservatives didn't want to have this discussion. They wanted to bash me as an unreconstructed new leftist. Very childish and very disappointing.
Well, they feel that they've been shunned. I think that there's a strong feeling among them of non-access, and we see the prominent ones and the very successful ones, but there are a lot of them out there who writing things. They have they would like jobs in the university. In fact.
Well, I really do believe, and I think this may be a conservative idea, we all have to overcome self-pity. Even though there are always reasons.
Resentment gets you nowhere.
Sorry?
Resentment doesn't get you anywhere.
No.
That's right. Well, look, listen, Todd, it's been a good conversation.
I've enjoyed it a lot.
And we'll be in touch. I'll actually send you a couple of things.
Please do, and I'd love to connect in some territorial venue.
That'd be great.
I hope we do that.
Okay.
Okay, great.
Bye-bye.
Bye.